Oh, yes, it will.
Amazing, absolutely gorgeous. Oof. I'm going to begin this week's sermon from a personal place about a serious accident that happened to me, and then we'll find our way toward the theology of Octavia Butler. She teaches us much about facing trauma, and her thinking ultimately helped me process my own experience, and certainly has far too many applications in this day and age. And in fact, the reading that Brenda Schroeb read for us earlier by Adrienne Marie Brown is in the legacy of Octavia Butler. She's another African American writer who's building off of the lessons of Octavia. I'm remembering the time I got hit by a car as a pedestrian. I was going about 25 miles an hour when it hit me. It was about 14 years ago, this Memorial Day weekend that's coming up. They were rushing oncoming traffic, making a left-hand turn, and they saw the crowd of pedestrians behind me and didn't see me. They wanted to save themselves a few seconds. I got hit and was thrown 10 or 15 feet and landed luckily on my bottom and not my head. My doctor told me that I was really quite lucky. My body decided on its own to remain relaxed. And as I was hit and thrown, if I had tensed up, she said the injury would have been far worse. It gives echoes to me from that reading from Adrienne Marie Brown earlier about moving with the change. The body is an interesting creature. With the adrenaline going, I was able to leave that accident and walk a mile to a friend's house. The next morning, though, I could barely hobble along to see my doctor 3 blocks away. It would take 2 weeks before I could safely navigate a sidewalk with a leg brace and crutches, and about 3 months before I could walk unaided. And that was just with cartilage and ligament damage. Amazingly, no bones were broken. Broken bones hurt more, but heal faster, I'm told by my doctor. Trauma stays in the body, hidden away till something reminds it that it's still there. For a couple of years, I couldn't go in a car. Even though I was a pedestrian in the accident, my mind associated cars with danger. I've unlearned most of these fears associated with now, these 14 years later, but I still will stop any friends with me from crossing a street against a light. Not that I was jaywalking when I was hit, but I still have a visceral reaction at wide crosswalks. About 3 years ago, I had a near repeat of this story. By a difference of no more than 6 inches, I avoided an exact repeat of the 14 years ago, being hit by a car as a pedestrian, also in Brooklyn. The driver was rushing oncoming traffic and making a left-hand turn into my path in the crosswalk again. Trauma is a fickle beast, and muscle memory can flash back in a moment. Everything hurt again, even though I wasn't actually hit this time. This time, probably because of my visceral response to all crosswalks, I was able to stop right before the car would have otherwise crashed into me. Don't get me wrong, not being hit is far preferable, but within 15 minutes, I began having a mixture of phantom echoes of the serious accident. Every muscle from leg to neck tensed up, and for about a week, it was still painful just sitting or standing. With all the changes we're living through, I'm thinking of our earlier quote from Brown and how we can partner with change and what mindfulness teaches about surrender or of letting go. All too often, in the world of spirituality and consumerist self-help, we use these words blithely like it's an easy thing to achieve. Trauma is a serious thing, and again, sometimes quite fickle, in what will bring it screaming again to the surface. In general, I go about my life not really thinking about the accident anymore, and then there are moments when I'm reliving it. So Octavia Butler, possibly her most famous quote on this matter is, "All that we touch changes, and what we change changes you." Whether we find ourselves facing the oncoming rush of what's next in life, able to roll with it or able to avoid it, we are always changing it, and we are always changed by it. Today's service reflects on the theology of Octavia Butler. She was an African American speculative fiction writer, a multiple recipient of both the Hugo and Nebula Awards. In 1995, she became the first science fiction writer to receive a MacArthur Fellowship. Her near-future science fiction writing presently explores worlds eerily like our own, namely in her 93 series that began with the parable of the sower. Almost 30 years ago, she wrote a book that was set around the time we are now in, or maybe set another 15 years in the future, but not much later than that. It was an America that was facing rampant forest fires due to climate change in the West Coast, the increasing failure of agricultural production, the breakdown of suburban communities, and the breakdown of basic rule of law. Instead of fake crisis with our southern border in the story, we were enmeshed in a military conflict with our northern border. And a faux religious president campaigned on the political motto, and I'm not kidding here, make America great again. I don't recommend it for an enjoyable read, but it is gripping and thought-provoking, and she develops some very serious theology through that series. And if we're going to discuss the virtues of letting go or surrender or partnering with change, I want to first begin with understanding what that might mean in the face of the reality of trauma. To move beyond the personal. Xenophobia is trauma. Climate change is trauma. The degradation of the basic rules of law is trauma. Segregation is trauma. Separate but equal is trauma. And none of that is science fiction. It's the world we live in. And although the worst of climate change is a contemporary reality, the other traumas I just mentioned have been threats since the dawn of civilization, as you all know. Trauma finds its way into our muscles and bones, and even after being healed, can still find its way out again and again. And to think about Ukraine in these terms, there is ancestral muscle memory for so many of us tied back to the horrors of the Second World War. Some of us are horrified for what is happening in that nation brought on by Putin's forces. And some of our family members remember this before. And those are two different experiences or responses. All that we touch changes. All that we change changes you. Octavia Butler takes a hard look at the spiritual and the social impact of change, the hardest spiritual truth. When communities slowly adjust to the times, we can get in the habit of critiquing anything different by labeling it change, as if that in itself makes it bad or wrong, even if the change is slow coming, well thought and out and well discussed. It's the universal buzzword to end all debate, the worst four-letter word, so to speak. And we live in a different reality now. The adjustments are not gradual. From an explosion of multi-platform and worship like this, and streaming to very sobering news that are rapidly closing. We are rapidly closing 6 million deaths worldwide to COVID, just shy of that right now, that we know of. These are not small changes, but heart-wrenching and traumatizing. Octavia Butler writing is as much theology as it is sci-fi, although she would always call it speculative fiction. Without rooting the plot, I want to share a little of her theology that I find translates universally to be true. Here are 4 short points that I'll share, and then I'll take a little time that we can talk more about them. The first one is, as we've heard, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. The second, there is no end to what a living world will demand of you. The third, we'll adapt. We'll have to. God is change. Strange how much it helps me to remember that, she says. And the fourth, drowning people sometimes die fighting the rescuers. That first quote, all that you touch, and that ends with the only lasting truth is change, God is change. Some of us are most familiar with this teaching in the Buddhist context, where our attachment to things not changing only leads to suffering, since all things change. An attachment to what cannot be is painful. The Serenity Prayer is a more modern version of this spiritual lesson. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. There are things that we can change, things we can affect in our lives, and there are many things we can't. Pain and hope. To face each as they come is one of the hardest lessons. But for Octavia Butler, she's looking at the message a little differently than Buddhism. Change for her is something like a rock banging against an object. All that you touch, you change. The rock can break another rock, or a window, or maybe a door, but the rock will probably also break at least a little bit of itself as it comes up against what it changes. Change always happens in relationship, it's never isolated. That's probably the part of the reason that it feels so difficult in community, because all the relationships are even more pronounced and obvious. It can feel like the change is compounding upon itself, that every little bit can begin to point us toward the biggest of changes in life, our own end. We all feel that worry at some time in our lives. And trauma, any form of trauma, moves that fear to the forefront. The next two theological quotes speak for themselves. There's no end to what a living world will demand of you, yet we often act surprised that the demands of a living world come again and again. And we'll adapt, we have to. God has changed. But Butler poignantly teaches us that, strange how much it helps me to remember that. We can catch ourselves always focused on the worst or on the end that the changes bring, but there's a deeper spirituality found in the practice of remembering that change is at the very foundation of our being. We can forget that we come into this world in an act of tremendous change with the cry of our baby voice, and that all that is and will ever be comes from that. Change is also our birthright, and there is a solace we can find in that when we open ourselves to that truth. There's a short Buddhist parable of a drop of water in an ocean on a wave, and it's at the peak of the wave, and it's a beautiful day, and it's a gorgeous sun coming down, and the drop of the water is in a beam of light and thinks everything is perfect. But then that has to change. And the teaching in the Buddhist parable is one that's saying, if you stay in this moment, that's all perfect. The rest of the ocean and the waves will not continue. It's always in motion. This is the virtue in surrender, in letting go, making yourself a partner in that change, as Brown talked about. It's not about giving up, but in recognizing that it's part of our nature. To let go of that which cannot ever be is to face our world and our situation as it is. And the last one, drowning people sometimes die fighting their rescuers. The novel, The Parable of the Sower, is a spiritual novel, but it's also a political one. I'll let you read that part of it on your own, but there's a line that meant to be political during a time of crisis that I also read as spiritual. People will find a tyrant we fear or a leader we follow. Leaving the politics aside, change can be either. In our seasons of loss and love, we can see change as the great tyrant to fear or a leader to follow. How we accept the changes before us, how we open our hearts to vulnerability, determines where our spirits will lead us. Will we see change as always and forever a tyrant and experience more suffering for it? Or we understand change to be a leader that can learn from as we live into a new day. Love and loss. For Butler, we are the life that perceives itself changing. We are the life that perceives itself changing. On some days, we may wish it otherwise for the grief that it brings. But self-awareness also allows us to experience love in our life, the spiritual truth that they come hand in hand. Change is, in a way, the great rescuer, even if we find ourselves flailing to keep it from taking us where it is going to take us. The great losses of life and health are the things that we have no power over. We can only grieve and hope someday to heal our hearts enough to carry on. But so often, we take the small losses and confuse them with the great ones, and we lessen ourselves for it. We risk drowning in the water while we fight our rescuers. So Butler and Brown invite us to make a partner of the days ahead of us. Amen and blessed be.